So as I was saying, that it's not necessarily the only solution, but it has some merits. So the reason I came up with this because I thought that, you know, this hot wallet problem, I didn't sort of think about this solution. I thought, you know, if I use my hardware wallet, for example, I cannot sign every single transaction as it required by the payment channel. So I thought, you know, what can I just pre-generate some stuff, put it in this automated process, and then do it for me. But then I discovered this solution as well, so which also works. So now, but we still have this downside of the locking up the funds and the number of transactions. So obviously, there's too many channels. And in the case of my initial design context, the iTunes store, you will have a lot of people who buy songs and a lot of people who are selling songs, but you don't expect me to buy all the songs of the same artist. I mean, yes, people do that, but most of the time I'm probably going to be like buying songs from different people. So I don't want to be established in a long-term channel. So one solution to that is obviously, like in Raiden, you've got a payment network, which has to be, or like a Lightning network. So it still has to be verified whether it works in practice. And the reason why it might not work is if you look at the history of Ripple. So Ripple initially designed as a network where you can have a mutual trust between the edges and nodes. And that was the idea, but when they actually when they deployed the network, they realized there's just simply not enough density in the network to build this network. So what they decided, they decided to make gateways. So everybody has to go through the gateways, and the gateways had like a circular pattern. But then even gateways went away, but for a different reason. So they never actually got to the point where they had a proper network. So that's why I think the network might eventually appear, but we need something else for the bootstrapping stage, like Ripple tried to do with the gateways. So if you have something like a facilitator in the middle, yes, it's centralized, but actually you can make it such a way that the facilitator doesn't have to be trusted. The facilitator brings a couple of advantages. So first of all, if everybody, all the payers, which are the consumers, are establishing the channels to facilitator, basically they pool their money in one contract. And then the facilitator can actually settle many channels on one go. So for example, the facilitator requires some more money because it runs out of capital, it needs to settle. But it wants to settle across like many channels all at once. So as long as there's a gas limit allows, it can actually do one transaction and settle many channels at once. And the other thing which a facilitator allows you to do is that, you know, this timeout, if the consumer wants to settle, it has to make a request, and then within the timeout, if the payee doesn't challenge, then they get the settlement. So because the facilitator is expected to be a professional entity which will constantly be watching the network, you can allow for smaller timeouts. You can say, oh yeah, because it's not just a single, like somebody, it's just a professionally run service. You can say we have a very small timeout so that consumer has a convenience that being able to settle quickly when they want to. They just want to withdraw their funds from the channel, and they expect the facilitator will be forgiving enough to do that. If it's not, then they can go to another one which is forgiven enough. So this is the concept I already described it. In my model, it's kind of somewhere in the middle between the simple payment channel and the like a state channels, which is but in this model, in exchange for payment, the payee does something, maybe on the swarm, maybe on some other document, maybe eventually on a blockchain, something which will allow the payer later on to litigate if as Victor mentions, that litigate if the payee didn't do that. So it actually makes a promise, and if the promise is not carried out, it can later litigate. And so in order to be able to litigate, yes, the obvious solution is receipts, right? So every time you send a payment, you expect a receipt. And the picture is almost the same, but it's just have the receipts in. Now, what the receipt needs to have as a property? So I figured out that there has to be like 4 properties. So each receipt has to be connected to the payment. in this, because then the facilitator has to be able to find whose payment corresponds to whose receipt. Then it has to be a link to this promised action, so that later on, when the litigation happens, that the receipt is presented, it needs to know what was the expected action. So if there's no action and there's a receipt, then you can litigate against the payee. And then another thing which is not very obvious is that the unique ID provided by the payer.